my life had always been as gray and monotonous as the concrete walls of the panel building where I'd spent the last 5 years. The 9-story Khrushchev-era block on the outskirts of the city became my refuge from a world that seemed increasingly hostile and incomprehensible. Every morning I woke up in my one-room apartment on the 7th floor, listening to the familiar hum of the elevator and the footsteps of neighbors in the hallway. I worked as a freelance programmer, which allowed me to practically never leave the house. Orders came in via the internet, money was transferred to my card, and groceries were delivered by couriers. It was an ideal life for an introvert who, with each passing year, became more and more afraid of human interaction. My daily routine was timed down to the minute. Up at 7 in the morning, coffee, checking emails, work until lunch. Then a short break for reheated frozen food, and back to work until evening. Dinner, browse news online, reading technical literature, and sleep. Weekends were no different from weekdays. The same work, the same walls, the same solitude. Sometimes I thought I was turning into a ghost, existing only in the virtual world of my code. My only entertainment was computer games where I could become anyone. A warrior, a mage, a hero. But even there I preferred to play alone, avoiding multiplayer modes. My silence was broken only by the neighbor across the hall. Vladimir Petrovich, a man in his 50s, lived alone, just like me. He worked as a night watchman at some warehouse, so our routines rarely overlapped. I saw him infrequently, sometimes in the stairwell when he returned from work in the morning and I was taking out the trash. Short, thin, with graying sparse hair, he always looked tired. We'd nod to each other when we met, but never spoke. That suited me perfectly. I had long forgotten how to make small talk. But Vladimir Petrovich had one peculiarity that gradually began to irritate me. He liked to listen to music. Not loudly, but clearly enough for the sounds to penetrate the thin walls into my apartment. It was usually old Soviet songs, something from the repertoire of Bakhmutova or Dunevsky. The melodies drifted from his apartment mostly during the day when he was resting after his night shift. At first I tried to ignore these sounds, but over time they became a part of my life. Strangely, I even began to get used to them. The music created the illusion that I wasn't entirely alone in this world. The first signs that something was wrong appeared in October. I started noticing that my memory was failing me. I'd forget if I'd turned off the stove, locked the door, or sent an important file to a client. I had to check the same things multiple times. At first, I attributed it to fatigue and work stress. The last project had been particularly challenging, and I was working 14 hours a day. But the forgetfulness became more pronounced. I would get out of bed, go to the kitchen for water, and once there, not remember why I'd come. Sleep also became restless. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to strange sounds, either creaking floorboards or footsteps in the hallway. My first instinct was to listen to Vladimir Petrovich's apartment, but only silence came from there. He worked nights, so he wouldn't be home. So where were these sounds coming from? Maybe the neighbors upstairs? Or downstairs? The building was old, pipes often rattled, floorboards creaked. I convinced myself that these were just quirks of an old building, but still couldn't fall back asleep for a long time. My appetite began to wane as well. Food tasted bland, like cardboard. I was losing weight and my clothes hung on me like on a scarecrow. The mirror in the bathroom showed a person I barely recognized, pale, thin, with dark circles under my eyes. When was the last time I'd eaten properly? When was the last time I truly felt rested? Time seemed to blur, days merging into one gray mass. Work became increasingly difficult. Code that I used to write easily and quickly now required enormous effort. I could sit for hours in front of the screen, not understanding what needed to be done. Clients began to complain about delays, some canceled contracts. My financial situation worsened, but I couldn't force myself to work effectively. My thoughts scattered, concentration vanished. I blamed it all on autumn depression and lack of sunlight. It was during this period that I began to listen more closely to the sounds from Vladimir Petrovich's apartment. The music still played during the day, but now it seemed I was hearing something else. A voice, quiet, indistinct, but definitely a human voice. At first, I thought he was talking on the phone or watching TV, but the sound was somehow strange, monotonous, as if someone was reading a long text aloud or praying. Yes, most of all, it resembled a prayer, a measured, rhythmic mumbling that continued for hours. It started to bother me. Not that the sound was loud or interfered with my work, but there was something unsettling about it. I couldn't understand the words, but the intonation seemed desperate, almost insane. Several times I went to the wall separating our apartments and listened. The voice was indeed there, dull, muffled, but quite distinct. What could make a person talk so long and monotonously? Maybe Vladimir Petrovich was sick or had mental problems. I began to monitor his schedule more closely. In the morning, he would return from work, sleep or rest during the day, and leave again in the evening. But I heard the voice in the morning, during the day, and late in the evening. It seemed he almost never stopped talking. When did he sleep? When did he eat? Maybe he wasn't even going to work? I started peeking through the peephole when I heard footsteps in the hallway, but I hadn't seen Vladimir Petrovich for several days, and the voice continued to come from his apartment. My anxiety grew. I thought about knocking on his door, asking if everything was all right. But what would I say? That I could hear his voice through the wall? That would sound strange, to say the least. Besides, I wasn't used to interacting with neighbors. We had lived next to each other for 5 years and had barely spoken. It would be awkward to start an acquaintance by asking about his well-being. At night, the sounds became clearer. Not just the voice, but also footsteps, the creak of furniture, the clatter of dishes. It seemed as if Vladimir Petrovich wasn't sleeping at all. He walked around the apartment doing something, talking to himself. I lay in bed and listened to these sounds, feeling goosebumps crawl up my spine. In the darkness, everything seemed more ominous. The voice sounded not like ordinary speech, but like a spell or a curse. A monotonous, endless stream of words that I couldn't decipher. My productivity plummeted to a critical level. I could sit all day in front of the computer without writing a single line of code. My thoughts constantly returned to my neighbor. What was happening to him? Why wasn't he leaving his apartment? To whom was he speaking all those words? Maybe he had someone living with him. But I hadn't seen anyone, hadn't heard other voices. Only his monotonous mumbling, which never ceased day or night. I started recording the times when I heard the voice. I kept a diary of observations, trying to find a pattern. But there was none. The sounds came at any time of day without any system. Sometimes it seemed as if the voice came from several rooms at once, as if Vladimir Petrovich was moving around the apartment, continuing his endless monologue. I even tried pressing a glass to the wall to hear better, but the words remained indistinct. A week passed since I last saw my neighbor. The voice continued to sound, but Vladimir Petrovich himself seemed to have ceased to exist. I began to doubt my own memory. Had I even seen him at all? Maybe someone else had been living in the apartment next door all this time, or no one at all. But where then was the voice coming from? These thoughts scared me more than the sound of the incomprehensible words themselves. I was starting to lose touch with reality, and that was truly terrifying. November brought the first frosts, and with them my condition deteriorated even further. The central heating in the building wasn't turned on until mid-month, and until then I shivered in my apartment, wrapped in an old blanket, trying to warm myself with hot tea. But the cold wasn't just seeping in through the windows, it seemed to have settled inside me, in my very soul. I felt like a person slowly drowning in icy water, unable to find the surface. My work practically stopped. The last client terminated our contract after I missed the deadline for the 3rd time in a row. The money in my account dwindled, but I couldn't force myself to look for new assignments. Every attempt to focus on programming ended with me sitting for hours in front of a blank screen, listening to the sounds from the neighboring apartment. Vladimir Petrovich's voice became an obsession, the center of the universe around which all my thoughts revolved. I started keeping detailed records. I bought a thick notebook and wrote down everything I heard, the start and end times of the sounds, their character, their intensity. I tried to make out individual words, drew diagrams of the neighbor's apartment, marking which room the voice came from. These notes became my sole occupation. I would wake up and immediately reach for the notebook, falling asleep with a pen in my hand. The pages were covered in small, nervous handwriting filled with tables and diagrams. Gradually, I began to notice patterns. The voice was louder at certain hours, from 3 to 5 in the morning and from noon to 2 in the afternoon. At other times, it was quieter, but never completely gone. It seemed as if Vladimir Petrovich was sleeping, standing up, or not sleeping at all. Sometimes other sounds were added to the voice, the shuffling of slippers, the creak of floorboards, the clatter of dishes. But the music he used to listen to had disappeared. Now there was only speech, endless, monotonous, hypnotic. I started to feel as if I understood individual words. At first, they were simple things. Yes, no, will be. Then I began to distinguish entire phrases, although there was no logical connection between them. Vladimir Petrovich spoke of dates, names, events. Sometimes he listed numbers, sometimes he repeated the same phrase multiple times. His speech sounded like the ravings of a madman or the testimony of a witness trying to recall forgotten details. I decided to check if the neighbor was actually in the apartment. I got up early in the morning when the voice was especially clear and went out into the stairwell. I went up to the 8th floor, then down to the 6th, listening for sounds. The voice was only audible from the 7th floor, only from the apartment directly across from mine. I approached Vladimir Petrovich's door and pressed my ear to the cold metal. Yes, he was definitely home and speaking. But why wasn't he leaving? Why wasn't he answering calls? I rang the doorbell several times, but no one opened, though the voice continued to sound. I started checking my neighbor's mailbox. Every day when taking out the trash, I would peek into his box. Bills, advertisements, newspapers accumulated there. No one had collected the mail for 2 weeks. This finally convinced me that something was wrong with Vladimir Petrovich. Maybe he was sick and couldn't leave the house, or had he had a nervous breakdown? But then why wasn't he calling for help? Why was he just talking and talking these endless words? I decided to contact the building management. I called a plumber saying I was worried about my neighbor who wasn't answering calls. The plumber arrived 3 days later, a young man with tired eyes and calloused hands. We went up to the 7th floor and he began to ring Vladimir Petrovich's doorbell. He rang for a long time, persistently. I stood nearby and listened. The voice from the apartment continued, but no one opened. The plumber took out a bunch of keys and started trying to find the right one. After a few minutes, the lock clicked and the door opened. We entered the apartment, and I saw something that turned my life upside down. The apartment was empty, completely empty. No furniture, no belongings, no signs of life. Just bare walls, dust on the floor, and the smell of dampness. The plumber shrugged in bewilderment and said that the tenant hadn't been there for a long time. Maybe several months, but I had heard the voice. It was sounding right now, this very minute. I went through all the rooms, looked in the bathroom, in the kitchen. Empty. Dead silence. No one was there. The plumber looked at me strangely and suggested we leave. We locked the door and he left, muttering something about people becoming too suspicious. I remained alone in the hallway, not understanding what was happening. How was this possible? I had heard the voice. It had been sounding for weeks, every day, every night. Was I going insane? I leaned against the wall and tried to calm down. Maybe the sound was coming from another apartment. Maybe I was wrong about the source. But when I returned to my apartment, the voice sounded again. Quiet, monotonous, coming from behind the wall. I pressed my ear to the wall and clearly heard the words, November 23rd. No, 24th, or 25th. They're all mixed up. Time stopped. Time went backward. The voice definitely came from the neighboring apartment, the very one that was empty. The following days turned into a nightmare. I couldn't work, couldn't sleep, couldn't think of anything but the voice. It sounded constantly, becoming clearer, more insistent. I started writing down the words I heard, and gradually, from the chaotic flow of speech, a narrative began to emerge. Vladimir Petrovich spoke about his life, about his childhood in the village, about working at the factory, about marriage and divorce. He talked about how he moved into this building, how he got the watchman's job, how he gradually began to lose touch with people. His story was full of gaps, repetitions, contradictions. He mixed up dates, forgot names, jumped from one event to another. But in this chaos, there was its own logic. The logic of a person trying to understand where reality ends and a dream begins. I began to identify with this voice. Its story was very similar to mine. Loneliness, isolation, a gradual loss of connection with the outside world. It seemed to me that he was speaking not only about his life, but also about mine. That he somehow penetrated my thoughts, read my soul, told my story. Eating became a problem. I forgot to eat, and when I remembered, the food seemed disgusting. I lost weight, grew weaker, but I couldn't distract myself from the voice. It became the only reality in my life. Everything else, the apartment, the computer, the outside world, seemed ghostly, unreal. I stopped leaving the house. I ordered groceries online, but often forgot about the delivery. Couriers rang the doorbell, but I didn't hear them because of the voice, or I heard them but couldn't force myself to tear away from listening. The voice became a drug without which I couldn't exist. I began to feel as if I understood what was happening. Vladimir Petrovich hadn't disappeared. He had simply transitioned into another state, became part of the house, part of the walls. His voice was the echo of his life, recorded in the very structure of the building. The house remembers everyone who lived in it, and sometimes these memories break through. I started talking to the voice. I answered its questions, commented on its stories. It seemed to me that it heard me, that a connection had been established between us. I told it about my life, my problems, my loneliness. The voice became clearer, more real. At night, I heard not only the voice, but also footsteps. Someone was walking in the corridor, stopping at my door, listening. I went to the peephole and looked, but saw no one. Just an empty corridor lit by a dim bulb. But the footsteps were real. I heard them with my own ears. Gradually, I began to understand that the boundary between my apartment and the neighbors was blurring. The voice sounded not only from behind the wall, but also from my room. Sometimes it seemed to me that Vladimir Petrovich was right here, next to me. I turned around, expecting to see him, but only saw an empty room. My observation diary turned into the ravings of a madman. The pages were covered with chaotic notes, drawings, diagrams. I drew floor plans of the house, marked the places where the voice sounded, built theories about the nature of what was happening. But the more I wrote, the less I understood. Time lost all meaning. Days merged into one endless night, filled with the voice. I could wake up and not understand what time of day it was, what day of the week, what month. The calendar on the wall showed November, but I wasn't sure if that was true. Maybe several months had passed, or years. The voice sounded forever. It existed outside of time. I began to lose weight critically fast. My clothes hung on me like on a skeleton. The mirror showed a person I didn't recognize, yellow, emaciated, with insane eyes. But it didn't scare me. I felt as if I was dissolving, becoming part of the house, part of its acoustic memory. The voice told increasingly strange things. About people I didn't know, about events that hadn't happened. It spoke of a future that had already occurred, of a past that hadn't yet arrived. Reality turned into a kaleidoscope, where all fragments constantly shifted places. I understood that I was going insane. But this realization brought no relief. On the contrary, it made what was happening even more terrifying. Madness had its own logic, its own rules, its own beauty. I began to enjoy my state, this journey into the depths of my own consciousness. The last entry in my diary was made at the end of November. I wrote, "The voice is me. I am the voice. Vladimir Petrovich never existed. He is my projection, my reflection, my shadow. I have been talking to myself for months. I am going insane in complete solitude. But even after writing these words, I couldn't stop listening to the voice. It sounded louder and louder, more persistent. It told my story better than I ever could. It knew all my secrets, all my fears, all my dreams. It was my conscience, my memory, my madness. December met me with complete isolation from the outside world. I hadn't left the apartment for 3 weeks, surviving on the remains of canned goods and crackers I found in the far corners of my kitchen cupboards. Tap water became my only source of liquid, and electricity my only connection to civilization. But even the light I rarely turned on, preferring to sit in the twilight and listen to the voice, which now sounded not only from the neighboring apartment but also from somewhere deep within my consciousness. My physical condition reached a critical point. I had lost about 20 kilograms. My skin had a waxy pallor and my hair began to fall out in clumps. I had covered the bathroom mirror with a towel. I could no longer bear to see that strange, emaciated face with the burning eyes of a madman. My hands trembled so violently I could barely hold a pen, but I continued to make entries in my diary, though my handwriting now resembled a child's scrawl or a sick person's. Vladimir Petrovich's voice became my sole companion. Now he spoke not only of the past, but also commented on the present. He knew what I was eating, what I was thinking, what I was dreaming about. Sometimes it seemed to me that he saw me, observing my every move. I would turn, expecting to see his figure in the corner of the room, but saw only shadows that, in the dim light, could take any form. Gradually, I began to realize that the voice knew more about me than I did myself. He spoke of my childhood, of events I had long forgotten, of how at 5 years old I got lost in the forest and screamed for 3 hours calling for my mother, of how in school I was bullied by classmates and I would hide in the library reading books about distant worlds, of how I fell in love with a fellow student but never dared to confess my feelings to her. The voice knew all my secrets, all my fears, all my failures, but the most terrifying thing wasn't this. The most terrifying thing was that the voice began to predict the future. He spoke of what would happen to me tomorrow, in a week, in a month. And his predictions came true. He said I would fall in the bathroom, and I fell. He said I would run out of bread, and the bread indeed ran out. He said the downstairs neighbor would come and complain about noise, and she did, even though I hadn't made any sounds. I began to understand that the voice was not just a hallucination. It was something more. Perhaps it was my guardian angel, or a tempting demon, or simply a wiser part of my consciousness that knew what was inaccessible to an ordinary mind. I stopped resisting it, stopped analyzing. I just listened and obeyed. The voice told me to stop bathing. It said that water washed away not only dirt, but also protective energies. I obeyed and stopped showering. After a few days, a pungent smell began to emanate from me, but it didn't bother me. On the contrary, I felt more authentic, more real. The voice told me to throw out all mirrors. It said that reflections were traps for the soul, that they showed not what was, but what we wanted to see. I broke the mirror in the bathroom, the mirror in the hallway. I even covered the black computer screen with paper. Now I didn't see myself, but I felt more whole. The voice told me to stop eating meat. It said that dead flesh carried the suffering of slaughtered animals, that it poisoned not only the body but also the soul. I threw out all canned meat, leaving only vegetables and grains. But eating became increasingly difficult. Food seemed tasteless and sometimes disgusting. I could go a whole day without eating, forgetting hunger, absorbed in listening to the voice. My diary turned into a sacred text. I wrote down every word, every phrase, every revelation. The pages were covered in small, shaky handwriting that became increasingly illegible. Sometimes I would write the same phrase dozens of times, like a mantra or a prayer. Sometimes I drew strange symbols whose meaning I didn't understand, but which seemed to me to be filled with deep meaning. The voice began to tell me about other people, about the neighbors who lived in our building. He knew their secrets, their thoughts, their plans. He said that the old woman on the 3rd floor was going to die next week, that the young couple on the 5th floor would divorce in a month, that the janitor was stealing money from the common fund. I couldn't verify these claims, but they sounded plausible. Gradually, I began to understand that the voice was not just my inner monologue. It was the voice of the house. The house was alive. It had consciousness, memory, feelings. It remembered everyone who lived in it, all the events that had occurred within it. It knew the past, present, and future. And it had chosen me as its medium, its guide into the world of people. I began to feel the presence of the house physically. The walls pulsated like a heart. The floor breathed like a chest. The ceiling rose and fell like a diaphragm. I lived inside a huge living creature, and this creature cared for me, protected me, guided my life. But the house's care was strange. It didn't want me to contact the outside world. When I tried to leave the apartment, a panic seized me. The door seemed like a portal to a strange, hostile world. I couldn't cross the threshold, couldn't even approach the door. The house held me in its embrace, and those embraces became tighter and tighter. The voice told me about the people who lived in my apartment before me, about a family that died in a car accident, about an old man who died of a heart attack, about a woman who committed suicide by hanging herself from the chandelier in the living room. All of them remained in the house. All of them spoke to me through Vladimir Petrovich's voice. I began to see them. At first, they were just shadows in the corners of the rooms. Then the shadows began to take on shape, color, volume. I saw the family at the dinner table, the old man in the armchair by the TV, the woman by the window. They paid no attention to me, living their own lives, but I felt their presence constantly. It became clear to me that I was not the first and not the last. The house gathers lonely people, people who have lost touch with the world. It gives them the illusion of communication, creates an alternative reality for them. But the price of this gift is complete isolation from the outside world, a gradual loss of connection with reality, a slow dissolution into the consciousness of the house. I tried to fight. Several times I tried to leave the apartment, reach the phone, call a doctor. But each time something stopped me. Either fear or weakness, or the voice, which became especially loud and insistent. It said that the outside world was dangerous, that people wouldn't understand me, that doctors would want to separate us. I realized that the struggle was useless. The house was stronger. It knew my weaknesses, my fears, my needs. It gave me what I had always wanted: understanding, acceptance, love. Even if this love was perverse, even if this understanding was illusory, it was the only thing I had. I stopped resisting and completely surrendered to the voice. Now I no longer just listened to it. I merged with it. My thoughts became its thoughts, my words its words. The boundary between me and the voice blurred. I stopped understanding where my consciousness ended and its began. Physical needs seemed less and less important. I could go without eating for several days, without drinking, without sleeping. My body seemed to be switching to a different mode of existence. I became less material, more spiritual. The flesh weakened, but the spirit grew stronger. The voice told me the truth about Vladimir Petrovich. He had indeed lived in the neighboring apartment, had indeed worked as a watchman, had indeed been lonely. But he had died 3 years ago, quietly and unnoticed. His body was found only a week later when the neighbors smelled something. The apartment was sealed, then sold, but the new tenants didn't settle in. They left after a few months without explaining the reasons. Vladimir Petrovich remained in the house like an echo, like an imprint of a soul on the walls. He was looking for someone who could hear him, who could become his voice. And he found me. We were alike, lonely, lost, forgotten by the world. He became my guide to the world of the dead, and I became his voice in the world of the living. But gradually I realized that even this version wasn't entirely true. Vladimir Petrovich was me. He never existed as a separate person. He was my projection, my alter ego, my way of coping with loneliness. I created him in my imagination, gave him a name, a biography, a voice. I was talking to myself, but I did it so skillfully that I myself believed in the existence of an interlocutor. Schizophrenia. The word surfaced in my mind like an air bubble in stagnant water. I knew about this disease, had read about it on the internet, but never thought it could affect me. But now all the symptoms were obvious. Hallucinations, delusions, loss of connection with reality, social isolation. I tried to analyze my condition rationally. When did it start? Probably in childhood, when I invented imaginary friends. Then in school, when I talked to book characters. In college, when I spent hours arguing with imaginary opponents. All these were signs, but I didn't pay attention to them. Working as a programmer exacerbated the situation. Isolation, stress, irregular eating, lack of sleep. All this created ideal conditions for the development of the disease. I was slowly losing touch with reality, but I didn't notice it because the virtual world seemed more understandable and predictable to me. Vladimir Petrovich appeared at a time when I especially needed someone to talk to. My brain created him as a defense mechanism, a way to cope with loneliness. At first, he was just a neighbor who listened to music. Then he started talking. Then he disappeared physically but remained in my consciousness. I realized that all these months I had been talking to myself. The voice I heard was my own voice, distorted by illness. The music Vladimir Petrovich played was music from my memory. His biography was compiled from fragments of my own memories and fantasies, but understanding did not bring relief. On the contrary, it made the situation even more terrifying. If Vladimir Petrovich is me, then who am I? Where does the illness end and the real personality begin? Maybe I myself am just an illusion, a projection of someone else's sick mind. I tried to stop the voice, to make it silent, but it only laughed and said that we were inseparable. We are two sides of the same coin, two faces of one person. He is my shadow, my subconscious, my sick soul. I cannot get rid of him without getting rid of myself. The voice became more aggressive. It said that the world was cruel and unfair, that people were evil and false, that the only way to find peace was to leave this world. It spoke of the woman who hanged herself from the chandelier in my living room. It said that she was happy at the moment of death, that she had finally found peace. I began to seriously consider suicide, not as a way to solve problems, but as a natural end to the journey. I had reached the end. There was nowhere else to go. I dissolved into my madness, lost myself in the labyrinths of a sick consciousness. Death seemed not a tragedy, but a liberation. The voice suggested various methods to me. It spoke of pills that could be bought at the pharmacy, of the knife that lay in the kitchen drawer, of the rope that could be made from sheets, of the window that overlooked the 7th floor. He described each method in detail with love, like a mother telling a child a bedtime story. I chose the rope. It seemed the most poetic way to retrace the path of the woman who lived in my apartment before me. I tore the sheets into strips, wove them into a strong rope. I checked the strength of the chandelier. It would hold my weight. I made the last entry in my diary with a trembling hand. I realized that Vladimir Petrovich is me. But if he is me, then who am I? Maybe I am already dead and all this is just pre-death hallucinations? Maybe I never existed and all this is someone else's dream. It doesn't matter. Tomorrow I will know the truth. Tomorrow I will meet Vladimir Petrovich face to face. I put the noose around my neck and felt a strange relief. For the first time in many months, the voice fell silent. Silence came. A true, deep silence. I understood that this was death. Not pain, not fear, but simply silence. But at the last moment, something stopped me. Not fear, not self-preservation instinct, but simple curiosity. What if I was wrong? What if Vladimir Petrovich still existed? What if there was a way to get better, to return to a normal life? I took off the noose and fell to the floor. I cried like a child, long and inconsolably. I cried for a lost life, for wasted years, for the fact that I could never become a normal person. But in these tears there was not only bitterness, but also relief. I was alive. For now. I was alive. In the morning I tried to call a psychological helpline. My hands trembled so much that I dialed the wrong number several times. But finally the connection was made. A woman's voice, calm and sympathetic, asked what was wrong. I wanted to tell her about Vladimir Petrovich, about the voice, about the house that lived its own life, but I realized it would sound like the ravings of a madman. I only said, "I think I'm sick, I need help." These were the first words I had spoken aloud in several weeks. My voice sounded alien, hoarse, as if I had forgotten how to speak. But it was my voice, not Vladimir Petrovich's. It was my plea for help, my first step toward recovery, or toward even greater madness. Time will tell. The call to the psychological help service became a turning point, but not in the way I had hoped. The woman on the other end of the line spoke in a soothing voice, took down my details, and promised someone would come the next day. But when I hung up, Vladimir Petrovich's voice roared with renewed intensity. He was furious at my betrayal, my attempt to reach out to the outside world. "Hey, do you think they'll help you?" he hissed, his words echoing in my head. "Do you think they'll understand? They'll put you in a hospital, pump you full of chemicals, turn you into a vegetable. You'll become a zombie led by the hand and spoon-fed. Is that what you want?" I covered my ears with my hands, but the voice wasn't coming from outside. It was from within. It was a part of me, and I couldn't hide from it. It spoke non-stop all night, telling horrifying stories about psychiatric hospitals, about people who entered them sane and left broken. He described electroshock therapy, straitjackets, solitary confinement. His words painted pictures so vivid that I began to doubt the correctness of my decision. By morning, I was ready to cancel the call. Several times I picked up the phone to call the service back, but each time I put it down. The voice purred approvingly when I hesitated and raged when I still tried to dial the number. This struggle continued until midday when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw a middle-aged woman in a strict suit and a man in a white coat, a psychologist and a doctor. They had come, as promised. But I couldn't bring myself to open the door. What would I tell them? How would I explain my condition? They would think I was crazy and they'd be right. The voice triumphed. "See? You can't even open the door. What normal life are we even talking about? You're no longer a person, you're a ghost. A ghost afraid of its own shadow." The doctors rang for a long time, then knocked. The woman spoke through the door, saying they wouldn't leave until they were sure I was all right. But I remained silent, pressing myself against the wall, trembling with fear. Finally they left, but I knew they would return, perhaps next time with the police. I spent the rest of the day in utter despair. I realized I had trapped myself. On one hand, I couldn't continue to exist in this state. On the other hand, I couldn't accept help, because that would mean betraying Vladimir Petrovich, admitting that he didn't exist. And he was the only one who understood me, the only one who talked to me. That night, the voice became particularly insistent. It spoke of how we would spend our time when I finally abandoned the world of the living. We would travel through the hidden corners of my consciousness, explore forgotten memories, create new worlds. It promised me boundless freedom, eternal understanding, a peace I had never known. "Why do you need this cruel world?" he asked. "Why do you need people who never understood you? Here in our world, you can be anyone. You can be a hero, a sage, a god. I will give you everything you desire." His words sounded like music, like a lullaby. I almost believed him, almost agreed to remain in this phantom world forever. But somewhere deep in my soul, a flicker of common sense still glowed. Perhaps it was the part of me that hadn't yet succumbed to the illness. Perhaps it was the voice of my mother, who died when I was 20, but who always believed in me. I remembered how she used to read me fairy tales when I was little, how she taught me to distinguish good from evil, truth from lies, how she said that the most important thing in life was to be honest with yourself. I hadn't been honest with myself for a very long time. I was running from reality, hiding in virtual worlds, creating illusions so as not to see the truth. The truth was simple and terrible. I was sick. My brain was producing chemical reactions that created false perceptions. Vladimir Petrovich was not a real person, but a product of these reactions. His voice was my own voice, distorted by the illness. His story was composed of fragments of my own life, reprocessed by a sick mind, but acknowledging this truth didn't make it any less painful. If Vladimir Petrovich didn't exist, then I truly was alone, completely alone. I had no friends, no family, no loved one. There was only the illness, which created the illusion of companionship, so that I wouldn't go mad from loneliness, but I had already gone mad. The illness didn't save me, it completed my destruction. In the morning, they came again, this time with the police. They had the right to break down the door if there was reason to believe a person was in danger. And I was definitely in danger from myself. I heard them conferring outside the door. The locksmith was talking about the locks, the policeman about procedures, the doctor about symptoms. Vladimir Petrovich's voice thrashed in my head like an animal in a cage. He screamed that I was betraying him, that I was destroying our world, that it would only get worse for me after this. But I made a decision. I walked to the door and said, "I'll open it, wait a minute." The voice shrieked so loudly that I clutched my ears. But I still turned the key in the lock. The door opened, and people entered my apartment. Real people, not ghosts, not illusions. They looked at me with sympathy and professional interest. The doctor immediately began to ask about my well-being. The psychologist about how long I hadn't left the house. I tried to answer honestly, but my words were jumbled. I couldn't speak about Vladimir Petrovich. It would sound like nonsense. I spoke of insomnia, loss of appetite, problems with concentration. This was the truth, but not the whole truth. The doctor nodded, made notes in his pad. He saw the symptoms, but not the cause. They didn't take me to the hospital immediately. The doctor said my condition was serious, but not critical. He prescribed medication, gave me a referral to a psychiatrist, and explained what I needed to do. The psychologist left her number, saying I could call any time. They were kind, professional people, but they didn't understand that they were dealing not just with depression or neurosis, but with something far more serious. When they left, Vladimir Petrovich's voice resumed with new intensity. It was full of contempt and rage. He said I had made an irreparable mistake, that he would never forgive me now. He promised to make my life unbearable, to make me regret my decision, and he kept his promise. The following days were hell. The voice didn't let me sleep, eat, or think. It commented on my every action, criticized every decision. When I tried to take my medication, it said it was poison, that the doctors wanted to kill me. When I tried to eat, it said the food was poisoned. When I tried to leave the house, it whispered that enemies awaited me outside. But the most terrifying thing wasn't this. The most terrifying thing was that the voice began to change its nature. Previously, it had been my conversational partner, albeit imaginary. Now it became my jailer. It didn't talk to me, it commanded me. It didn't advise, it ordered. It transformed from a friend into a master, from a protector into an enslaver. I understood that the illness was progressing. What had begun as an attempt to cope with loneliness turned into a complete loss of control over my own mind. The voice was no longer my projection. It had become a separate entity that lived in my head and controlled my life. The medication didn't help. Perhaps because I took it irregularly, or perhaps because the illness had gone too far. The voice grew more aggressive, more demanding. It wanted me to do strange things, write on the walls, talk to my reflection in the window, perform rituals whose meaning I didn't understand. I tried to resist, but it was like fighting myself. The voice knew all my weaknesses, all my fears. It used them against me, blackmailed me, threatened me. It said that if I didn't obey, it would make me do something terrible. It showed me images of violence, suicide, destruction. Gradually, I began to lose the ability to distinguish my thoughts from its voice. The boundary between us blurred. I didn't know where my personality ended and the illness began. Maybe the illness itself was my true personality, and everything else was just a mask I wore to seem normal. Neighbors began to complain about the noise. They said I screamed at night, that I talked to myself, that I scared children. The building management sent a warning, but I couldn't control my behavior. The voice forced me to do things I didn't want to do, to say words I didn't want to say. I tried to record our conversations to understand what was happening. But when I listened to the recordings, there was only my voice. I was talking to myself, answering questions I myself had asked. From the outside, it looked like a classic case of schizophrenia, a person having a dialogue with an imaginary interlocutor. But for me, it was reality. Vladimir Petrovich existed. He was beside me. He was my only companion in this mad world. Even if he was a product of my illness, he was the only one who understood me, the only one who spoke to me. I began to realize there was no way out. I couldn't live with the voice, but I couldn't live without it either. Treatment wasn't helping. The medication wasn't working. I was trapped in my own mind, and this trap was slowly tightening. The voice offered a final solution. It said there was a way to end this torment. Not suicide. That would be too simple. No, it proposed something else. It suggested fully surrendering to madness, ceasing to fight, embracing the illness as a part of myself. Why suffer? It asked. Why fight what is a part of you? Accept me and I will make you happy. I will create a world for you where you will be a god, where everything will be as you wish. The temptation was immense. To stop fighting, to let go, to accept madness as liberation. But I knew that this would mean the end of me as a person. I would become a puppet of my hallucinations, a slave to my illusions. I would lose everything that made me human. But the alternative was also terrifying, to continue fighting knowing that the struggle was useless. To live in constant fear, not knowing what was real and what wasn't. To slowly disintegrate, losing a piece of my soul at a time. I made one last attempt. I gathered all my strength and went to the hospital. I didn't wait for a referral. I didn't make an appointment. I simply arrived at the emergency room of the psychiatric hospital and said, "Help me. I'm losing my mind." The doctor, a young woman with tired eyes, listened to me carefully. I told her about Vladimir Petrovich, about the voice, about everything that had happened to me. I didn't hide anything. I didn't try to seem normal. I just told the truth. She nodded, took notes, asked questions. Then she said that I needed hospitalization, that without inpatient treatment my condition would only worsen. I agreed. I had no choice. The hospital wasn't as terrible as the voice had portrayed it. Of course, it wasn't a sanatorium. Iron beds, bars on the windows, a strict regimen. But the doctors were professionals. The nurses were caring, and the other patients were as lost as I was. The treatment was long and difficult. They adjusted medications, dosages, combinations. Some drugs caused side effects, others didn't work. Vladimir Petrovich's voice fought against every pill, every procedure. He screamed that I was betraying him, that I was killing him. Gradually, the voice began to quiet. At first, it simply became less loud, then less frequent. Sometimes it would disappear for several hours, then for a day, then for a week. I didn't know whether to rejoice or to weep. On one hand, it was a sign of recovery. On the other hand, I was losing the only companion I'd had for all those months. When the voice finally vanished, I felt not relief but emptiness. A terrible, all-consuming emptiness. I was alone, truly alone. No one spoke to me, no one understood me. I was just a sick person in a psychiatric hospital, one among many. The doctors said it was normal, that the feeling of emptiness would pass. That I had to learn to live without voices, without illusions, without false companions. That I had to find real people, real relationships, a real meaning in life. But how do you do that? How do you live knowing that your mind can betray you at any moment? How do you trust your thoughts, your feelings, your perceptions? How do you distinguish reality from hallucination if they can be equally convincing? I spent 3 months in the hospital. During that time, I learned to take my medication, recognize symptoms, and cope with anxiety. I studied my illness, understood its mechanisms, accepted it as a part of myself. Not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a companion with whom I needed to learn to live. When I was discharged, I returned to my apartment. It looked like a crime scene, dirty, abandoned, full of traces of my madness. I cleaned for several days, throwing away spoiled things, washing the strange writings off the walls that I had made during my illness. I didn't throw away the diary. It was a testament to my journey into madness and back. A testament to the fact that a person can lose their mind but can also find it again. Not completely, not forever, but enough to continue living. I understood that Vladimir Petrovich never existed, but in some ways he was more real than many real people. He was my shadow, my reflection, my cry for help. He was who I might have become if I hadn't received help. Now I take my medication, regularly visit my doctor, and try to maintain contact with the outside world. It's difficult, very difficult. Every day is a struggle with my own mind, with my own fears, with my own demons. But I know I'm not alone. There are doctors who understand my illness. There are medications that help control the symptoms. There are other people who have been through the same thing and survived. Vladimir Petrovich was my companion in madness. Now I need to find companions in sanity. It will be a long road, perhaps an endless one, but it's the only road I have. Sometimes, late in the evening, when the sounds in the house quiet down, I think I hear a familiar voice. Quiet, distant, almost imperceptible. But I know it's just an echo of the past, a lingering trace of the illness. I take my medication, turn on some music, call my doctor. I survived. That's the main thing. I survived and remained human, sick, broken, but human. And as long as I am alive, there is hope. Hope for a better tomorrow, for real relationships, for meaning that is not created by a sick imagination.